Hi. Before we talk about our eternal existence, I wanted to share with you one characteristic of wave-based dimensions, and that is interpenetration. This means that the dimensions exist in the same physical space. The physical dimension and all the non-physical dimensions exist together. And you can use an analogy of wireless communications. AM, FM radio stations, TV networks, Wi-Fi networks, they all exist in the same physical space because they're communicating at different frequencies. The same thing is true with the non-physical dimensions, is that they are vibrating at different frequencies from the physical, and that's how they can exist in this. That's one way you can explain dark matter and dark energy, is that you have different dimensions in the same physical space, and we're actually recording or monitoring that extra energy and extra matter from the different dimensions, but you can't see it because it's not in the physical. So I wanted to share that with you before we talked about our eternal existence in a wave-based multiple dimension environment. First, I'd like to start with a thought experiment. So imagine floating in front of you, you have a cube, a square, a line, and a point. And you can turn that cube to where it looks like a square to you, but if you had a square, you couldn't turn it to look like a cube. The same thing is true with a square. You can turn it to look like a line, and with a line, you can turn it to look like a point, but a point can never look like a line, and a line can never look like a square. So what this means is that higher dimensional objects can go to a lower dimension, but lower dimensional objects can't go to a higher dimension. And the same is true in terms of time. Think of a movie. You can stop a movie to where an image looks like a picture or a photograph, but a photograph can never look like a movie. So it's the same principle. And the same thing is true with higher dimensions. And I'm going to use a formula for the standing wave vibration of a string to explain this, is the different boundaries between the dimensions. So where you have frequency here, I'm not going to talk about these formulas. I'm going to talk about the one on the end, and specifically the variables that are under the square root, and it's tension and density. So these two offset each other so that you can have the same frequency range in different dimensions. And you can imagine the image of a guitar. Think of the guitar stock over here. You have different densities of strings on a guitar, and with the different tensions or the different thicknesses, you can still strike the same letter in this, or note, in this case, an E on the thinnest string. You can put your finger on a fret here and pluck that note E on the second string, put your finger here and pluck it on the third, and so on and so on and so on. So the same would be true for the different dimensions, is that we have a denser dimension in the physical dimension from the higher dimensions, and they have less density as you move up. But it's that offset of density with the tension in the dimensions. So each string would be like a dimensional boundary, but within each dimension, you have the same frequency range. You can look at the different dimensions in this regard too, where each plane is a different dimension. Where we have our physical body here in the densest dimension, then you have different bodies in the higher dimension. When I spoke about this thought experiment, in order for our consciousness to move from higher dimensions to lower dimensions, it has to move through a body in those different dimensions. And that's why we're showing these different bodies here, is that you have bodies in higher dimensions that connect your consciousness in the highest dimension with your physical body in the lowest dimension. And that's a topic for another discussion. I won't discuss it here in this podcast, but we can discuss it later on. If you're interested, put a note in the comments, and maybe I'll create a video to describe it. But this goes back to that chart of the different dimensions that I showed you in the previous session, where you shed your body to move your consciousness from a lower dimension to a higher dimension. You're moving your wave-based consciousness from your physical body into an etheric body, into an astral body, or into a mental body. And that's how you can have an eternal being existing in the physical space. Now, think about it in terms of our education. If we're eternal beings, how can you teach an eternal being about controlling their emotions or controlling their ego? You can't do it if they are an eternal being, but you could if they believe that they live in a temporary environment to where they live and die. And so you put that eternal being in a physical body and you subject them to unnecessary deaths from illness, from war, from being victims of a crime. And that can generate emotions, among other things. It can generate emotions, but it creates an environment to where that being has to learn how to control their emotions. Similarly, you tempt them with great wealth or celebrity or power and influence, and they have to learn how to control their egos. But it becomes this temporary environment in the physical dimension becomes a great teaching environment because the eternal beings think that they're temporary. And when they think they're temporary, they have all different kinds of challenges for how they live. But if they knew that they were eternal beings, they wouldn't have these same reactions or responses when they're confronted with different situations. So that's an explanation of our eternal existence. In the next session, I'll talk about a few more experiments that you could do to help justify a wave-based reality, and then we'll wrap up with a conclusion. I hope you'll join me. I hope you'll hit the like button and share this podcast with your friends, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.